think we'll get started. Even I know folks will probably be trickling in from the other parts of the conference now. So just to get my little spiel out of the way. So hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. We really appreciate your participation in this Learning Lab, but also in the annual conference in general. We hope you've been enjoying both days so far. My name is Paul Sherman, and I'm the Director of Programs for SID-US. So first and foremost, I want to thank all of our panel here today, or speakers for this Learning Lab. We really appreciate your participation in this. I think it'll be a really interesting conversation and different than what we've done in the past. So great to hear your perspectives on how to make a podcast. So I won't get too much into the details. I'll let Jodi explain and provide the background for this. I just want to say just some housekeeping pieces. One, feel free to ask questions at any point during the conversation. You don't have to wait until the very end. We will be keeping track of questions throughout the course of the conversation, and then we'll be relaying them to Jodi verbally. So that's not an issue at all, so don't be shy. And then we're happy to, so I guess, I'll leave it at that. We're happy to have everyone here, and I'll just briefly introduce Jodi. So Jodi is the Career Development Specialist for the Peace Corps. She also runs her own podcast, Global Reentry Presents Jobs with Jodi. So we're happy to have her here moderating this discussion along with Benjamin and Michelle, and I'll let Jodi fill you in on the details with Michelle and Benjamin's background. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jodi.
Great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that, Paul. And it's really a pleasure to be here with SID Washington in this capacity. And I'm especially excited to be here in this Learning Lab because it's very near and dear to my heart as a fellow podcaster. And I'm joined by two amazing podcasters. I'm very much of a newbie, and we started this last year at the National Peace Corps Association with the podcast. I'm currently working with the National Peace Corps Association, which is confusing. It's kind of like Peace Corps. I was with Peace Corps for 12 years. Now I'm working with the National Peace Corps Association, which is NPCA, in a similar role. I'm the Career Development Specialist. So my job is to help not only the returning Peace Corps volunteers, get employment, all of those who were, evacuated. We had 7,000 volunteers that were evacuated as of COVID last March. And so I was brought on shortly thereafter in April, and I worked with with folks that needed assistance in, helping move on from there. So career stuff is my real passion, right? So resumes and mock interviews and all of that fun stuff, plus doing webinars. And in my role there, my boss, Dan Baker, who I know some of you know as well, he suggested, let's do a podcast, because of course podcasts are the thing right now, right? Everyone's doing podcasts. And so I had zero experience in podcasting. So this has been a journey for me, and a great one, and a very much of a learning environment. And I hope that today will be able to be a forum. We really want this Learning Lab to be interactive. We want you all to be able to ask questions. And we already have a question in the chat box for what do you want to leave here with? Because honestly, 50 minutes is not going to be enough time for us to cover everything involved in podcasting, but we'll definitely point you to some other resources and cover as much as we can. So without further ado, I do want to turn it over. I want to actually kick it off by asking our guests, who are both podcast hosts, I'm going to have them both introduce themselves, and just in recognition of our limited time, we're not going to do full bios of our own, long introductions. We're going to keep it very succinct, and instead Sid is going to be dumping into the chat box the bio, so you can read more about them and all of what they've done and are doing. So it's just exciting to have you both here. Michelle and Ben, very, very pleased to have you here. Michelle, can you go ahead and start by introducing yourself, maybe sharing, your title, your organization you work with, the podcast name, and maybe very briefly your journey to podcasting and creating your awesome podcast.
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Michelle McKenzie, and the name of my podcast is Where's the Funding? And I'm also the founder of Agazella, which is a platform for helping entrepreneurs to learn, launch, and scale. And the podcast fits in nicely with the purpose of um, Agazella. And there's a connection between the two. So I won't get into that yet until later. But just happy to be on this podcasting journey. Started last year, just like Jodi. Actually started right at the beginning of the pandemic, as it created a great opportunity because of the pause to think about things that I've wanted to do, but didn't have the time to think about how to actually get started. So it was a great opportunity to lean in. And I'll turn it over to Benjamin for his introduction.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks to Sid Washington for having us here. This is super exciting. So my name is Benjamin. I use he, him pronouns. I am the host and creator of the Techawat with Benjamin Morse podcast. My journey is much shorter already, actually, than Jodi and Michelle. So I launched in January of this year, just hit 10 episodes, which is very exciting. And my conversations are really about travel and how travel ignites change in each of us, and kind of trying to open up the aperture to what those experiences are like for a really diverse group of folks, and kind of diving into, how travel kind of engenders revolutionary change among us. So I think a lot of the RPCVs in the room can probably relate to that, but many in the Foreign Service and all sorts of other kind of travel experiences, I'm sure, can jump into that as well.
Great. Thank you so much. And Ben, it's hard to believe that you're on episode number 10. Don't let that fool you, anyone who's out there thinking that he's just getting started. He is very much of a professional in this. And in fact, I've been following his podcast, and we have really taken so much from the way that he's done his podcast and incorporated it into how we're doing ours, because it's just so organized, and it's a great example. So I want to hear from you more later on that aspect. I'll definitely be asking you about that. But let's ask the audience, because again, we want this to be interactive. So the audience, including the panelists, please, for Ben and Michelle, if you can just respond in the chat box, what are your favorite podcasts? Both those that are international development focused and beyond. So what are your favorite podcasts and why? Why do you like those particular ones? There's obviously a huge amount of podcasts to choose from out there. So I also love this question because I learn more that I can hopefully check out. So
I'm going to go first, Jodi, because I'm going to disappoint you a little bit and say that I actually don't listen to international development podcasts, because I work in international development and I download that content all day long. So I don't particularly devote my podcast listening time to that. I use my podcast listening time as an opportunity to lean into and learn about other things.
Sure. And that makes sense, because especially with your podcast that you do being related to international development, like you said, right, you're doing that all day. So you already have a lot of that content. So it's great. You can use it for those that you just want to relax and listen to. Awesome. Thank you, Michelle. How about you, Ben?
Yeah, so I threw it in the chat.
I'm sorry.
Jerome Moore. Yeah, no worries. Jerome Moore is he's an RPCV, super awesome podcast host. He hosts one called Black Americans Making Their Mark Stories Abroad, which really tells the stories and experiences of Black Americans, which is definitely underrepresented in the podcast world for kind of sharing those stories abroad. But also, he talks to a lot of RPCVs within that series and really kind of dispels some stereotypes and myths for that particular population. So he's a really great interview. I'd highly recommend jumping into that show.
Awesome. And one that I'm putting in the chat box right now, as well as I'm trying to multitask, is Stories of Transformation by Bakhtash Ahadi. And he is an RPCV, and I should clarify, returned Peace Corps volunteer. We who are RPCVs, we always use the acronym, but some of you may not know that. So Stories of Transformation, and it's by Bakhtash, Baktash, Ahadi, Ahadi. I'm throwing it in the chat box right here for you. I love that one as well. It's so well done, and it's really aimed at telling the stories of transformation. He really does a lot of intercultural, and there's a lot of international populations. He is Afghani and was a Peace Corps volunteer, and then also was a part of the military. He was a translator in Afghanistan, during everything going on there, and he just has a really interesting story to tell himself. But the guests that he brings on are everything from award-winning filmmakers to just people who've changed in so many interesting ways and brought more knowledge to the public. So it's one that I really like. So I'm just looking through here to see some of the other ones, and I'm wondering if Ben, do you recognize any of these other ones that are coming up in the chat box? There's several. Let's see. Higher Learning with Van Lathan and Rachel Lindsay. Nice. Many of these I don't know. Oh, I love Dare to Lead, Brene Brown. Obviously, that's a really, really good one, and another of my favorites too. So this is wonderful. Lots of great ones coming in here. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that and helping us all kind of expand our our availability, or our available podcast that might be worth checking out. So wonderful. So to the panelists, or to my fellow podcasters, what podcasts or resources have been most useful to you in like learning the ropes of podcasting or how to? So it doesn't have to be a podcast. It could be other resources that have helped you to really, create the great podcast that you have. They're both really, really awesome. So I'm interested in both. Either of you can go first on this. Michelle, would you like to go first?
Sure, I'll go first. And I'll start with the backstory of how I decided to do this podcast.
Mm-hmm.
So it was having conversations. I work in international development and providing funding to entrepreneurs and seeing some of the challenges, particularly with access to finance, access to funding, and realizing that access to funding across the board for Black entrepreneurs, whether you're here in the United States or globally, is an issue. And having a conversation with an entrepreneur that I knew in a coffee shop, and she asked, I started initially with a co-host, and now I'm solo. My co-host and I, if we could send a cheer up message to her supply chain partner in Ghana, who makes the shea butter soaps that's in her line, that's in Whole Foods. And she was looking to expand into other Whole Foods stores in the Northeast Atlantic region. But for her to be able to scale into more Whole Foods store, that means her supplier needs to be able to scale up production as well. And she was having trouble finding funding to be able to do that. And she was having a rough day. And for people who are entrepreneurs or no entrepreneurs, you know that it's an emotional journey to being an entrepreneur. There's lots of ups and downs, lots of rejections, lots of difficulties that come along with it. And so she said, can you let's send this cheer up video to this person. And we're like, sure. And we sent the video, and then she turns to us and she said, why don't you guys do a podcast to talk about this? And we're like, yeah, cute. And we didn't do anything about it for a while. I went on temporary duty overseas to Niger, and I was there for 3 months towards the end of 2019. And then the person who was my co-host messages me, and she's like, do you want us to do this podcast? And I'm like, yeah, sure. But if we're going to do this, we're going to do this. Recognizing that it might take some work, but I had no idea how much work it would actually take. And I think Benjamin can speak to this when he goes. And so I got back to the States in January of 2020. And so we now started to do our research about how to start a podcast. And I must say that we were becoming quite overwhelmed. There is so much information out there, and folks who provide a lot of this information can get so technical into that. I'm like, I'm not trying to become a music engineer. I don't need all of this information. Right. And I reached out to a friend of mine who is a professor at, I think, Bowie State. And I think she had a student who was in the, AV program or something, but was helping someone else with a podcast. And so I messaged this person, and we met him at a coffee shop. I'm like, we'll give you $50 for an hour to tell us how to start a podcast. So we met him.
Nice.
He's like, well, there's an app called Anchor. And you're like, really? So there's literally an app for that? And we were wasting all of this time spinning our wheels, reading through all of this stuff that was just making us more confused and basically a deterrent, because between January, I'll talk about Anchor a little bit more, Ava.
That's great.
It delayed our being able to get started because I got back in January and we didn't start until March, because I was reading all of these other resources that were just turning me around. It was just more information than I needed. And Anchor is almost like an app for dummies, which is exactly what I needed, because I didn't want to invest that much time into learning something new. I wanted to get started. And he basically walked us around the app. This is what you do. This is how you do it. And we goes, probably the best $50 we spent, but I wish I knew I could have spent this $50 sooner. Right. So that we could have gotten started. And so that's how we got started with our podcast. And after Benjamin goes, and if people want to know more about Anchor, I can talk about that too. But Benjamin, over to you.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, Michelle, I can relate to so many dimensions of your story there. I think that, the origin story is really important, I think, for everyone to kind of sit with for a little while. And for me, I really decided to embark on my journey as a way to reconnect with some of the most influential people that I had met in my life. A lot of these connections happened while traveling, and it kind of became a through line from a topical perspective for me. But it really gave me an excuse to kind of call up some old folks, some old colleagues of mine, and say, hey, you want to chat in this medium? And I think that that's really empowering. One of the kind of first steps that I took, agree 100%, Michelle and Jodi, I'm sure you can relate to this as well. It is overwhelming. There are so many resources out there. And I think that there's a spectrum too. There's definitely the resources out there for the folks that really do want to get into the audio engineering behind it and dive into like the minutia of what it means to actually go through and like perfect your audio. And it's cool if that's your thing. I think as a host, you're also you're the creative engine of your podcast. You're the one that's trying to bring that vision. You're trying to identify the guests and thread that needle and tell the stories. And that's kind of a different task than the kind of technical side of things. So I did a lot of exploration on my own. I also use Anchor. It's a really wonderful tool. There's a lot of ways to kind of customize as well and plug in some other tools if you do want to get a little more advanced in your recording and editing, which I've done a little bit of. But I would say kind of advice on first steps is just start talking to people. Reach out to anyone you know that has done anything related to podcasting or recording or media production and just pick their brain. I basically did a whole bunch of informational interviews with people and just tried to learn as much as I could. And that kind of set me on my journey in a way that, reflecting back, it's every step seemed quite difficult. But as you kind of go through those baby steps, like you eventually you make your way toward that summit, and you don't want to focus on that summit because there's a lot of steps in between. But if you really focus on kind of what's in front of you and kind of chunk it out into attainable and realistic micro steps, then you'll be there before you know it. And that's really, I think, what's made my journey as someone who's doing this largely solo to like get over those kind of initial hurdles and get into a space where I feel like I can actually be that creative person that I really want to be.
That's wonderful. And, because there have been several questions from, the audience about Anchor, and interestingly enough, when I was looking at your podcast, Michelle, I remember seeing one of your episodes on the very front end. It had some kind of a plug for, Anchor, and it just sounds like a great platform. Can you tell us, is there a fee for that one, or, how does the structure work? Is it like a one-stop shop where you would just pay a certain fee and then that gives you access, or is it free?
Anchor is free.
Great.
Free.
We love free.
Which are the best resources, right? And not just free and good. I don't want free and not useful, but free and good. Right. And Anchor is definitely that. And I actually need to move that to the mid-roll because I hear they pay more for mid-roll ads. So also Anchor allows you to be able to monetize your podcast with ads.
Nice.
Just starting out by promoting Anchor on the Anchor platform in your podcast, and I actually just activated that.
Oh,
And I would
wow.
say that when you're getting started, just start where you are. Do not, at least for me, I still don't feel as if I have a perfect podcast. Start where you are and improve as you go along and learn as you go along. Someone's saying spell the software name, ANCHOR, Anchor. I believe it's already in the chat.
Yeah, like
And
an anchor on a boat.
It allows you to record in the app, to edit in the app, to distribute. It distributes to various listening platforms such as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, all of those. So it cuts out a lot of the work. It makes podcasting very easy, because once you upload and publish your podcast, you're kind of done. All you have to do is then promote it on your own. You don't have to do all of that work of making sure that your podcast shows up on all these podcast listening platforms. One thing that I would say, I wouldn't recommend, and I don't know if they've updated this, I wouldn't recommend recording directly into Anchor. We started out trying to do that, and there were lots of reverb and issues. And I remember one episode, there was so much reverb, we had to go back, and which is something you don't want to do, to ask the guests for more of their time to re-record. And that was after having that experience, that was the last time we recorded in Anchor, and then switched or recording to Zencaster. And now I just record using Zoom. And the reason why I do that, I actually take the videos from the Zoom, and then instead of making audiograms that I was making before, I just use that video to make videograms and then use them as promo material for the podcast.
Nice.
So I think the link is in the chat. So I'd recommend you guys to just check out Anchor. Benjamin, over to you.
And Benjamin, can you actually cover in this, is it at all similar to Buzzsprout, or does it have a lot more features than Buzzsprout, which many people go through to have their podcast distributed to all these different channels?
Yeah, these are all great questions. I think, there's a lot of different places that you can host your podcast. And really the mechanism behind that is, you have a place where you're basically storing that audio data, and then you get what's called an RSS feed. And that RSS feed is something that you go to, like Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or Spotify, and you actually, a lot of these platforms will do it for you. Anchor does it for you if you choose to do it that way. I choose to do it manually. So I go to all the different platforms and I enter in my RSS feed. Once it's approved on the platforms, then, when you add a new episode, it just automatically appears within the cache, which is really nice. I think that there's, you can go through like the list. There's a whole bunch of resources out there to compare all of these different, Buzzsprout, Anchor, and there's a whole bunch of different kind of hosting capabilities. I think that in the beginning, simplicity is definitely your ally here. And really, like Michelle was saying, all you really need is this, like the audio, like the microphone in our phones these days is much higher quality than the microphone that's in your computer. So if you can, just record exclusively using your smartphone, you're going to get pretty good quality. And there's also a lot of tips out there for like how far to put the microphone in front of your face. And like, if you're remote, you can send along kind of this list of recording tips for your guests. Like Michelle mentioned reverb. So you can your guests, like, don't record in like a really confined space with a lot of flat surfaces, because you're going to get that echo. Go in your closet, build a pillow fort, do what you have to do. There's a lot of really cool tricks. And I think that you start kind of diving into that when you read and kind of explore on your own, and you'll figure out like what works for you. And I think on that front, I've learned that, each guest has different technical capabilities. And some of my guests are podcast hosts themselves. Their audio sounds better than my audio, and they just do an amazing job. Other guests, I've had a couple of folks that are like retired, foreign service officers, or folks that have spent, they spend a lot of trying to figure out how to set up everything, and I'll just go really simple with that, right? And there's going to be a spectrum, but one of the resources I think that has been really helpful for me is, as Jodi mentioned, I create what I call like a one pager, but it basically like describes my show. It gives like some basic tips on how to record, like optimal setup. I do kind of a quick scoping Google form so I can learn about my guests beforehand, so I can save some time there. I have a release form that I attach to that for kind of the permissions purposes. And I think that like one of my bigger tips from a tools perspective is just get those templates in place and find something, like find your process and just try to repeat it over and over again. And it takes that lift off of yourself. Organizations like companies like Anchor, they do a lot of that for you. So, a lot of it is automated and built in. And I think that's why Michelle and I use it, because it really is so seamless. But try to find that cadence and kind of stick to it, because that repetitiveness will save you a tremendous amount of effort down the line.
Great. And just as a reminder, really quickly, please do put your questions into the chat box, because we'll be moving to the audience Q&A. We want to make sure to get to as many of those questions as possible. So thanks in advance for doing that. And speaking of that, we're getting so many great comments in there in terms of podcast suggestions or things like that. Make sure that you save your chat, which you can do, of course, by going to the chat box and just clicking on where you would leave a message, the three dots with the square around it, and just download the chat or save the chat, however it says, so that you have that at your disposal. I don't know if they'll be getting those to you included in any follow-up, but just that's another way to work around it. So great. So back to a few more questions here on like the getting started. What do people, I guess, need to consider before getting started, and what are the elements, what are the elements of a successful podcast, like how they, to make it successful? Michelle, would you like to start with that one?
I'll let Benjamin lead on that one, and then
Sure.
I'll pick up.
Sure, Benjamin. Sorry, Benjamin.
Yeah. No, this is one of my favorite questions, because my answer is really simple. It's really understanding and knowing your why. Like, why are you doing this? And that
Simon
will,
Sinek.
I think, exactly. Like it will drive you through everything. And if you have a really good grasp of what you're passionate about, you're doing something that you really love, and you're totally cool if only your mom listens to it and that's it, then you're in the right spot, right? And I think that for me is something that was really important. And the other piece, I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. I have 2 young boys, and part of my motivation for even doing the podcast in the first place was to leave a bit of a legacy behind for them to listen to when they're older. And who knows if that'll actually happen, but it's something that I've definitely found motivates me to push through when I need to edit, or when I need to schedule another recording, or some of the tasks that are a little more monotonous, I would say. And maybe they fall in the column of like, I have to do this, versus like, oh, I really love doing this part. So trying to figure out like what it is that you are excited about, and where you're excited to spend that time, because it's going to be, especially in the beginning, it's going to be a pretty big time investment. And then beyond that, like, there's a lot of resources out there that will give you like what do I need to think about before starting a podcast checklists. And like I said, there's a lot there. And if you just break it down into like very manageable steps, and don't try to do it all in one day, give yourself a runway to kind of ramp up into it. In fact, it took me about 6 months from when I decided I was going to do it to when I launched my first episode. And I think that runway allowed me some time to educate myself, and to practice, and to fail a little bit, and to kind of incrementally get myself where I wanted to be to launch the first episode, which I think, gets you well underway. Michelle, what do you have?
Benjamin, I'm so glad how you started focusing on your why. I have what I call the 3M methodology for starting a podcast, which is mission, message, and market, right? What's your mission? What are you trying to do with this podcast? Are you trying to spark conversations? Are you trying to educate? What are you trying to do? What's the end game for your podcast? Why are you doing it? Because I'll tell you something, podcasting actually takes a lot more time investment than people think. So if you're going to do this, make sure that you have a strong mission for why you want to do it. And then what's your message? What's the message that you want to get out there in the world? And then your market, who is this message for? And what is it supposed to do for them? How does it benefit them? Do they want it? Do they need it? Will they consume it? And so these are the questions that you should ask yourself. So the 3 M's: mission, message, and market. And then that will help you in terms of, well, how do I promote this podcast? I still can't say that I'm the best person at promotion because I have a full-time job. I have a new business. I'm starting to get off the ground, and this podcast that takes a lot of time. So I'm still struggling with that. But, knowing that you have a dedicated group of people who do consume your content, who do find it useful. And then you start there and working on different ways to tap into other groups of people who might want to consume your content. And also I use my guests. I ask them to promote. So I ask them to help promote their episodes and share it with their friends and families and network, and to rate and review the episodes. So that's a great way. And if you have a guest that has a strong network, then that can help you with promo. Can I answer a question that I saw in the chat while
Sure. Go ahead, Michelle.
So someone asked about time length. And then after I answer, I can turn it over to Benjamin, maybe if he has something to add, whether or not the time length of each episode, does it vary? So what I'm starting to learn is that I feel like between 30 to 45 minutes is the sweet spot for where people want to listen. So now I've had episodes that were either shorter, much longer. I'm trying to do a much better job now of time management with my guests because in my head, I know where I want to go. And I know that, okay, by the time I add their recorded bio to it, or by the time I add, this thing is going to extend it a little bit more. So I try to get them to stop at a certain timestamp, so that, when I do post-production, it'll be at a certain length. So I think 30 to 45 minutes is a nice sweet spot for listening. I would say you can go under, and you could maybe go a little bit over, but I would say try to stay in that time lane. And maybe Benjamin has something to add to that.
Yeah, I would agree with that sweet spot. I also think it depends on the style of your show, right? So you think of like NPR's Up First, they're 15 minutes on the dot, their news show. You think of longer form interviews with people like Joe Rogan or some of these other podcasts that are really trying to get into someone's full story. Those go 2-3 hours sometimes, right? So I think it really depends on the style of show that you have. And what, kind of how deep you're going with your guests. If it's an interview show, if it's a solo show, then you have obviously a little more control over how long you want to speak. But I totally agree with Michelle in that, trying to optimize your time with your guest and, trying to be consistent, but also adaptive and flexible as things come up. And for me, I do a lot of the editing in kind of a separate software after the fact. And I'm not shy about cutting out 10 minutes of a conversation because we kind of went outside of the scope and it was going to balloon the episode a little bit too much for where I wanted it to be. So I'm totally someone that would go in there and kind of chop it up and cut it a bit.
So along those lines, some of the questions that are coming in from the audience, one is a little more about, the time investment, how many hours do you put in per episode? Like Benjamin, I know you're doing you're kind of the one-man show for this. How many hours does it take you total to make one podcast?
So this is where I go back to the passion and the knowing your why. Because it does take a lot. My typical process is, once I've identified a guest, I'll kind of send out that one pager. I'll schedule a scoping call, which is usually about, 30, 45 minutes with a guest to just kind of chat, get to know them a little bit, build some rapport, try to pull out some of the nuance of their story without like actually going through the whole episode in a dry run. So there's definitely a balance there, but really trying to make them feel comfortable with the format, answer their questions, those pieces. And there's always a little bit of research that you need to do before those conversations. You kind of know where you want to scope and kind of what questions you have for them. And then in between that conversation and my actual recording, I'll typically, spend a few hours just kind of going through maybe there's a book that they wrote, maybe there's some other interviews that exist out there, just doing some research on who they are. Maybe they're like your best friend, so you don't have to do that for this particular episode. But spending some time kind of reflecting on where you want the conversation to go. And then obviously recording the episode takes a bit. And then for me, it's editing on the back end and then the kind of marketing and promotion end. So I think it's hard to like put a solid number per episode because I think each episode is different, but you're going to be
maybe you're afraid to do so.
Right. Yeah. Maybe I just haven't thought about it. And I don't want to hold that mirror up quite yet. Michelle, what would you add to that?
Similar. So yes, definitely the scoping interviews before the recording are crucial because you don't want to be meeting your guests, especially if it's someone you're not closely familiar with, because now I find that people are pitching themselves or other people for the podcast, so I don't know them. So I have to have a conversation with them to understand what's the right angle, as Benjamin mentioned, for the show. So there's that, then there's the recording. And I don't do my own editing like Benjamin does because I don't have those skills, and that's okay, right? Mm-hmm. That's why things like Anchor exist, and there are other things. So there are also people who can edit your podcast for you. And so I send mine out. I provide everything. So I usually record the bio for the person, put some music behind it. So I have that. I send the interview files, and I send that to someone, and they edit, and I give them detailed instructions for where I want them to cut, things like that, put it together. I have to write the show notes, then spend time re-listening to the episode to write the show notes. And so I've created a template for that sort of makes it a little bit easier for me to put the show notes together and there are parts of it that don't change, like the call to action is always the same, the bias, all of that. And so all of that takes time. And then the promo, having to promote each episode. And then how much promo do you do for each? Sometimes I get a little lazy and, I might just post one time about a particular episode when it probably needs more. So it's all about what's going on in your week.
Right.
At that moment when an episode comes out. And that's why I also send the podcast link and the promo materials to the guest as well. I'm like, here are the materials. You can promote your episode as well. Because It benefits you and it benefits me. So yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, some people will throw those things even on their LinkedIn or, something or other kinds of, they'll have an interview with them featured, and that's awesome. That's great. So another question from the audience. We have a question about tips for building an audience, and we've maybe kind of alluded to it, but can each of you talk briefly about what has been most effective? I mean, you've already talked, Michelle, about the great way of sharing it with your guest and having them enlisted in the process, right? Are there other tips or advice you would have for how to build a bigger audience, for your podcast? Benjamin, maybe you want to start with this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the golden question right there. I really do think that having a diversity of content and perspectives included in your podcast, if it's an interview-based podcast, is really helpful because, again, like Michelle said, as you're having your guests kind of send it out to their network, then you're engaging with maybe an entirely new potential audience. So every opportunity to source a new guest, you should also look at it as like a lead generation opportunity. So, it shouldn't be like your main criteria, but, taking a look at folks and like how many followers do they have on Instagram, or what's their position within an organization, and how does that look on LinkedIn, or just trying to do some of that like market perception just to kind of see where people stand. And again, kind of diversifying your perspectives featured in the podcast will really like open up that scope. I also I think there's a lot of challenge, I think there's a lot of traps, I guess I would say, for folks that just start a podcast, and you're going to get direct messages from all sorts of people promising you thousands upon thousands of listeners and all these things. And just don't waste any time or breath on those types of things. Because again, I think the best way, especially for, if you're working in a nonprofit or if you're doing this for yourself, you're really trying to build an authentic brand, and you're really trying to represent yourself in a way that kind of resonates with your core values and who you are and what message you're trying to get out there. So being yourself and just showing up and just being consistent, I think is my number one piece of advice. And just knowing that it's not gonna go overnight. Just go ahead and throw that out the frame of mind. Know that it's going to take some time, and often I've talked to a couple of podcasters that have had their shows around for maybe 6 months, a year. The folks that have their shows around for 1 or 2 years, they see pretty significant spikes in listenership. So being patient and kind of getting over those traditional hurdles, where I think a lot of podcasts end after, I think it's 10 or 12 episodes. It's the common okay, did this thing, I'm done. So showing your kind of resiliency and just keep on showing up, I think is the other piece of that puzzle. Michelle, what would you add to that?
Yeah, and that brings us back to what's your mission for the podcast? If you're using the podcast as a sort of a personal branding thing, or a thing that's gonna get you to go viral, then you might quit at 10 if your audience is not growing as you think it should. It's not TikTok, it's not Instagram Reels. So you shouldn't expect that, oh, I put my podcast out and 1,000 people are going to listen to my first episode. It might not work that way. So you have to really think about, what are you really trying to do with the podcast? And I see someone has in the chat, how can podcasts be leveraged for profit making? So yes. I wouldn't necessarily say profit making for this, but as an outshoot of my podcast, I started Agazella, which is an online learning academy for emerging market entrepreneurs. So it's a continuation of talking about access to funding to support entrepreneurship. And so also I'm now just integrating the two things together, so that the podcast is content also for Agazella and for the website, and so that they feed each other. And then that could be another way for more people to learn about the podcast. And when I do webinars that promote Agazella and courses that we're launching, also talking about the podcast as a resource. So you have to look at ways of that. So there are people who are very good, if their podcast goes viral, that can monetize their podcast by, getting sponsors and things like that, and get opportunities to do other things. If that's a goal of yours, then you might approach it in a different way. Or you can see, well, what else can I do to build on this podcast that could be profit generating?
Great. And both of you, that was really great information. And along those lines, a question for you, Michelle, your nonprofit that you have, right? Your podcast is it's within that, or not at all? Did you say it's within that, right? Because one of the questions
it's not a nonprofit. It's a profit making. It's an online learning academy. But we work with nonprofits that are looking for grants and things like that, and entrepreneurs who are looking for opportunities for financing. And so we talk with entrepreneurs who share their entrepreneurship journey, because one of the things we also want to do is demystify entrepreneurship. And most of my international development work has been on the African continent, and entrepreneurship has been pushed there sort of like as the antidote for the youth bulge, and all of the youth in Africa are expected to be entrepreneurs, but there's a lot to it. And so a lot of the people who come on the podcast really talk about the struggles of the journey, launching, and those who are looking to scale, and the struggles finding funding to be able to do so. And so that's what that focuses on. And then now from there, what are some of the resources that those entrepreneurs need that could be provided by Agazella? in terms of
Gotcha.
of training. And so that's why the tagline for Agazella is learn, launch, and scale.
Right. So the next question from the audience is really regarding the nonprofit realm. The question reads, on the point of it being a lot of work, developing a podcast, any suggestions for starting a podcast in like a nonprofit and are they a good idea? Another question was, do they make sense creating a podcast for a nonprofit or other organization? Either of you
Jodi,
can.
I would almost kick this back to you, Jodi.
Yeah.
I mean, what would you say about your Jobs with Jodi podcast and how you feel like it's helping you at the National Peace Corps Association kind of move your goals forward?
Sure, Ben. And I'm happy to answer that. We made a conscious decision of going into the, podcast realm because we felt that this was really where everyone was, right? This is where people are starting to get more of their information. This is what people connect with, right? When you were talking earlier about, I can put on a podcast and go on my walk and just know that it's 20 minutes or it's a half hour or however long it is, right? People are that's how they're getting their news, their medium, their information. And so we thought it would be valuable for us. We thought, what kind of information would be helpful to people for a podcast? And so our podcast very much focuses largely on career related aspects, but it might be a career panel. It might be focusing on an RPCV, a returned Peace Corps volunteer who's a leader in something, talking about their experience so that people can gain inspiration and just insight into different, areas. And so that's why we created it. And I'm very, happy we have done it. We have not spent as much time on, this is why this is great to hear these kinds of tips from you, Benjamin, as well, expanding it and getting the word out there. We definitely have, it's been growing and that's great. And I love the suggestion. We've been doing this too, of sharing the final feature, sharing it with your guests to say, here it is, feel free to spread it however you like. And, thanks again, that kind of thing. So I think it definitely has a place in certain organizations. I think it very much depends on what are you trying to get from that. And it goes back to probably, Benjamin, what's the why? Don't just do it to do it, right? Because it's work and all of that, but it can be really rewarding and it can help you reach the audience that you're trying to reach. So that's what I would say. Thanks for turning the tables there, Benjamin.
If I may add something.
Yes.
Again, going back to your mission. So if you have a nonprofit, how can you use this podcast as a communication tool to either communicate with your audience that you're serving, that your services are directed to, or how do you use it as a communication tool to connect to funders? Because if you have a podcast out there, that's something, if you're applying for a grant, that they might check out your podcast to learn more about your programming and what you're doing. So it's all about being strategic about what's your mission? What are you trying to accomplish with the podcast? And if you're very clear on that, then you can figure out what's the best way to strategically position that podcast for whatever outcome it is that you're trying to achieve.
Great. Thank you to both of you. Those are great comments. And I realize in looking at time and tracking the time, we are actually technically at the end of this session. We do have a few minutes extra that we can stay on. If there are some additional questions, we would love to, if there's one or two additional ones, we'd love to, answer those as much as possible. But I do want to thank everyone for being here today. I want to, in particular, thank our special guests, the panelists here, Michelle and Benjamin, for sharing your insight and for allowing us to SID, Washington, for allowing us to be part of your great conference. I have a wealth of respect, a lot of respect for what you do and the organization. And it's just really exciting to be part of this conference in this way. So thank you all for that. And let's see if we do have any other questions. Actually, folks are saying, thank you, just appreciating it. So if there are any other questions, please feel free to put those in the chat box quickly. Michelle and Benjamin and I will not go anywhere right now, but certainly understand if other folks are done and need to run to your next commitment. So.
Yeah, I was looking through the chat too, and I think the questions that we have that were outstanding were mostly addressed by what you had talked about. So I think we're in good shape.
Right.
If there is actually one additional I think it's just about reaching out for a one-on-one.
I'm sorry, who is that from?
It's recently from Elizabeth Warfield.
Yep, and whoever she is in, yeah, if she's interested in reaching out to me, I'm happy to, I'll check the chat box here and put my email in if she's interested in me, or if it's to the rest of you, Ben and Michelle, whatever way makes sense. Thank you.
Right. All right. Thanks, everyone. So just to wrap up, I want to say, obviously, thank you to our panel here, Jodi, for moderating this discussion, and for Michelle and Benjamin for taking the time out of your busy schedules. We really do appreciate you talking about your experience in starting podcasts. This was a really interesting conversation. Again, I think the only thing I'll say, just to wrap up, just to point you in the direction of where to go next for the different parts of the day. We do have our last few pieces of the conference coming up with our plenaries coming up this afternoon. So as with other parts of the conference, go to just the agenda tab of the platform, and you should be able to scroll through and find the links to accessing the next plenary. So we are looking forward to that, and we're really excited about those. So please do check those out. I'll also plug too that there will be a survey coming out. It won't be today. It'll be coming up with, sometime soon within the next 24 hours. So please do fill that out. It really helps us we do really take your feedback into consideration when we are trying to plan out not only our annual conference, but all the events that we do. So we really do take it into consideration. And I believe that's everything I have to say. So thank you so much for your participation today. And we hope to see you at the upcoming plenaries. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.